Good morning from Washington, D.C. This is Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I would like to welcome you to this special event, special seminar on Sudan's humanitarian crisis and the war of military elites, prospects for a resolution. We didn't initially plan it on purpose, but as you know, things are moving. Today, the parties are meeting, not necessarily for the first time, in Geneva, Switzerland, to try to find this missing resolution that we are talking about. And we wish them well. I hope that they will reach a peaceful resolution beneficial to the people of Sudan. But by way of introduction, before I introduce our participants in this webinar, let me just say a few remarks about the topic by way of introduction. As everybody knows, on April 15, 2023, fighting broke out between the Sudanese armed forces led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces led by Commander Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hameti. The two generals, of course, were not strangers to each other. They have actually been partners in the power struggle that preceded this period. They joined forces in the coup of October 2021 against the joint military-civilian transitional government at the time, which was established following the toppling of longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir in April 2019. Here, after about, I would say, 16 months of war, Sudan is today facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis with 16,000 people killed, at least 10 million forcibly displaced, 18 million, which amounts to 37% of the population, acutely food insecure, and many subject to all kinds of abuse, and including sexual violence. Both warring parties continue to commit today, as we speak, human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. The war is further sustained and somewhat exacerbated by foreign interference and weapons supplies from neighboring African states and other countries near and far, like Egypt, Russia, the UAE, and others. Thus far, round of talks and mediation efforts have not succeeded in producing a resolution to the conflict. And that's why some of us are hopeful maybe that the ongoing talks in Switzerland might put an end to that stalemate. In light of its long-standing commitment to peaceful and just resolution to conflicts in the Arab region, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is convening this panel of experts to discuss the war in Sudan and the ensuing humanitarian crisis. Our distinguished panelists have been asked to outline the factors that led to the present crisis, give us a little bit of background, and address current humanitarian and human rights condition, examine challenges facing the reaching of a political process, and provide recommendations for the way forward. We have coordinated this panel and asked our distinguished guests, again, to address some specific questions, including I will mention 4 or 5 that will be the core of our discussion today. Khulud, welcome. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. The questions we're going to be focusing on are, why did the Jeddah process facilitated by the US and Saudi Arabia fail? What are the prospects for a breakthrough in the US-led ceasefire talks that started yesterday, August 14, in Switzerland? What is the role of the United Nations and other international legal bodies and the future of accountability efforts in this conflict? What are the prospects for a democratic transition in Sudan? How should the United States, the EU, and countries in the region, and Africa and the Middle East help facilitate mediation efforts and help bring this war to an end? To help us answer these questions and others, we're not limited to just these 5 questions, although these are like the general outline for the discussion today. We have, like I said, 4 distinguished guests today, or panelists, and I will introduce them in the order they will be speaking. And at the end, each one will have about 12 minutes, an hour divided by all four of them. And then we will have the balance of our time focused on the art of conversation to entertain questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page. Identify yourself and direct your questions if you care to specific panelists if you want to. Our first, sorry, had a little glitch here. Our first speaker will be Dr. Khalid Mustafa Medani, Associate Professor and Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies and Chair of the African Studies Program at McGill University. He has taught at on many campuses in the Middle East and overseas in the West. And currently he's joining us actually from Cairo. So welcome, Dr. Khalid. And he will be focusing on the roots of the current conflict in a way and the perpetrators of the violence that I mentioned in the introduction and the impact of foreign interventions in the Sudan. Khalid will be followed by Jehan Henry, who's an independent consultant on human rights and international justice. She's the former East Africa director at Human Rights Watch. She has spent a lot of time lecturing, teaching, and doing work and research on this topic in Sudan, in the region, and in the West. The current state of human rights is going to be kind of her focus. Political rights, ethnic cleansing, humanitarian conditions, sexual violence that I mentioned also, introduction and other issues of relevance. Jehan will be followed by Hassan El-Haj Ali, who is a senior researcher, a colleague actually, at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute. We are very delighted that he took time off of his busy schedule to join us today. And he has been asked to focus on the role of the military particularly and give us a little bit of background on that, the paramilitaries groups, coups, military interventions, impact on governance and civil-military relations in general in the Sudan. Last but not least, our friend Khulud Khair, renowned Sudanese political analyst and the founding director of Confluence Advisory. I love the name, Khulud, a think and do tank. Not only think, but think and do in Khartoum. And she will also help us focus on challenges to reaching a resolution. So her remarks would be very timely in light, as I said, of the Geneva meetings that started yesterday. So again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this important panel on Sudan. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin with Dr. Khalid Medani, if you don't mind. The microphone is yours. Please activate your microphone and proceed.
Thank you very much, Khalil. It's a real honor to be back on, and so as part of Arab Center panel. Since I'm the first person, I want to thank you for your consistent attention to Sudan. I always have to say that if I'm introduced first. I'm also very honored to be with my friends and colleagues who are on this panel. And I know Khulud and I have been on several panels together. It's wonderful to see her, and also I admire all the work that she and Dr. Hassan are doing and all that Sudanese are doing. With respect to understanding the roots of the conflict, I think it's always best for those who don't often follow Sudan or don't follow it regularly to define the conflict itself. One begins with a definition that this is a war between, as you put it in the title for this panel, a war between two military elites, two generals, two military institutions, but not necessarily a civil war. That is a bit counterintuitive for those who are familiar with civil wars elsewhere. So the first order of business is to define it as not a civil war, but a war between two military institutions, two military leaders and generals that previously, as you said, Khalil, had partnered to do something very important, and that is from our perspective and the perspective of the majority of Sudanese, and that is to basically stymie the very important revolution that began in December of 2018, leading us to this moment moment. Say, since I begin first, that this war has, of course, between two generals, the majority of the Sudanese people, by which I mean there are no constituencies, really large constituencies in civil society supporting either side, but it's also a war that has expanded throughout the country. Sudan has suffered a great deal of wars, beginning since 1955, a succession of wars in the south, in Darfur and elsewhere. But this war is even unprecedented by that scale. As you put it, over perhaps 10 million displaced internally, 2 million refugees, the complete destruction of the infrastructure, the absence of any hospitals, the last one perhaps falling in Darfur, in Al-Fashir in the north, the expansion of disease, cholera, and the lack of facilities to prevent that kind of spread of disease, the thousands who have killed. And as one UN report put it, it really is a failure of humanity in the sense that compounded to all of this devastation is the lack of attention, the lack of funding. And so that's why, in many ways, the majority of Sudanese welcome these negotiations, or did welcome them when they were announced, not as a sign of capitulation to either side, but really as a way to finally bring some kind of peace. But very quickly, in terms of the roots of the conflicts, there are many kind of starting points, but I always begin with the critical juncture of the coup of 1989, with the rise of the Bashir regime, and particularly the Islamist-backed regime of the National Congress Party. The reason I do that is that it's very important for those who don't follow Sudan to understand the kind of policies and institutions and laws that led us to this kind of horrible moment. And in that period, in the summer of 1989, I was actually there in Sudan when the military coup, led by Omar Bashir, but supported by the Islamist movement of the country, overthrew a democratically elected government, at that time led by Prime Minister, the late Sadiq al-Mahdi. Very importantly, immediately following that military coup, this regime, or the previous regime, instituted what Sudanese know as the kind of policy of empowerment, or tamkeen. It had three very important kind of policies that I think your listeners will understand in terms of its linkage to the present war. The first was to basically and by loyalist regime. And what they did is they enacted laws that eventually expelled over 800,000 Sudanese from the bureaucracy, and replaced by loyalists of the Islamist movement. The other aspect was a complete kind of policy of trying to dominate the economy, that is to basically expel rivals in the private sector and the public sector, and install kind of a hegemony, an economic hegemony of what we call the Islamist deep state in Sudan. And the third very important one, and perhaps most directly related to the present war, is a policy of coup-proofing that students of political science will understand immediately, is how autocratic, authoritarian military regimes kind of the policies they enact in order to prevent two things. That is the kind of military coups from within their military ranks, but also to put down dissent against military rule. And that policy factionalized the security apparatus. And this is extremely important because it's very germane to what is happening currently. And that is, the policy was intended and did in fact realize the weakening of the Sudan armed forces, and the rise and emergence and funding of paramilitary militias. The idea was, of course, once again, to coup-proof, but that also became accelerated in the context of the First Darfur War in 2003. And these militias, first the Janjaweed in 2003, were sponsored, financed by the Islamist regime of Bashir in order to put down the insurgency that began in that year, in Darfur. People, I think, are familiar with the devastation of that war that led to the killing of over 200,000 civilians, if not more, and the expulsion of millions more to neighboring countries, mostly in Chad. That really helps us understand the kind of context that occurs in the late 2018, when the revolution emerges after cycles of protests, like in other Arab countries, the Arab Spring moment, of course, for Sudan. And that led, you are aware, something very historic, the first real expansion of a revolution and protest that encompassed the entire country. Sudan had never experienced something like this before. It begins in the rural areas and expands across the board throughout Sudan, across class and ethnic group, and leads ultimately, as Sudan watchers were following very closely at the time, to the fall of Omar Bashir in April of 2019. It's really from that moment, I'm going to expedite this narrative a little bit to kind of bring us up to date, but it really is at that moment where you have what we call, once again in political science, the kind of attempts to upgrade authoritarianism, the attempts on the part of the kind of the national movement, the National Congress Party, but particularly what we call the Security and Intelligence Committee, the top rank of the military, to maintain their authoritarian rule, and most importantly, of course, their economic assets that they kind of they generated through 30 years of military rule. And the way they did that was to enact, in conjunction, I would add, with the support of external parties and the United Nations, a soft landing, as we say in Sudan. That is a compromise that really brought us to this point. And that compromise was to partner with civilian leaders that were part and parcel, who may have not led the revolution, but Sudanese from this kind of perspective feel were essentially co-opted the revolution, in the sense that they excluded very much many of the revolutionaries themselves, the resistance committees, the grassroots movements and mobilization and groups, and made a partnership with the military regime. That, I think, is the moment that brings us to this crisis. I want to emphasize for those who do not follow Sudan, as you said, Khalil, that this was a partnership not only between the top brass of the military and the civilian leaders organized around a coalition called the Forces of Freedom of Change, but most importantly, it was a partnership, a long-standing partnership between Hemeti, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, the current leader of the Rapid Support Forces, the kind of latest iteration of the Janjaweed, and Burhan, General Abdel Fattah Burhan. And it's very important to emphasize that these two generals were partners for over 20 years, not only in putting down dissent in Darfur and putting down the uprisings and colluding to massacre hundreds of young Sudanese to expel them from a sit-in in Khartoum, but they also partnered very importantly along two very important lines. Number one, over the domestic economy, the kind of oil and other resources that they basically, kind of biddied out between the two of them. And they partnered, and this is very important because of the recent objections of Abdel Fattah Burhan's regime, and that is they partnered with respect to their alliances with the outside world. They were the ones who brokered an agreement with the United Arab Emirates in order to support them in the war in Yemen, to send mercenaries there in 2015. They were the ones who supported and brought in the Wagner Group, the Russians at that time, during that period. And so the question is, and here I need to conclude to allow my colleagues to jump in, but I do want to bring us up to date in terms of why, after over 20 years of a deep partnership that really not only was responsible for the killing, displacement of millions of Sudanese prior to this war and the domination of the local economy, we also have to understand that the root causes of their kind of bitter rivalry that has led to this kind of devastation in Sudan. And that led to, and the reason for that, and I want to emphasize that here, was the sheer strength, and I've kind of talked about this elsewhere and written about it, the sheer strength and popularity and legitimacy of the popular revolution itself. The consistent protest by Sudanese across the board, if not on a daily basis, then on a weekly basis, post this kind of partnership, a rejection of this kind of partnership between civilians and military, despite all attempts on the part of both Burhan and Hemeti to stymie this revolution, protests continued. And the important kind of point here is that, and I can detail how that led to this present war in our Q&A, but it's very important to understand that as a result of the consistent protest, pro-democracy protest, and anti-authoritarian, and I would argue the anti-Islamist National Congress Party protest, what happened eventually is in October 2021, both of them, and I want to emphasize both of them conspired to wage that basically, or they, at their minds, ended this kind of attempt on the part of the Sudanese people to transition to a democracy. The interesting thing here, both sides to get back to some kind of resolution and transition or return to transition to civilian under the auspices of the international community, under a framework agreement. And here, two important elements really lead us to this war. For those who are not completely familiar with the kind of chronology of this war. And in late December 2022, what occurred is basically a contentious kind of discussions around two very important points. One of them was the merging of the paramilitary militias to the, the National Standing Army, to the Burhan kind of army, which is was a central kind of demand of the revolutionaries themselves and the revolution. And that, of course, was a source of great disagreement. Hemeti wanted it to occur over the course of 10 years. Burhan, of course, wanted it to happen over the course of a year. Hemeti refused because he felt and understood that that would actually undermine his power, not only militarily, but his kind of control over gold and his economy. But the other one I want to mention that is not always mentioned, and I want to emphasize here, and that was another central demand of the revolution and those hoping for transition to democracy, and that was the dismantling of the deep state. Izalat al-tamkin, the kind of policies that were demanded to actually call for accountability, not only in terms of justice and human rights, but accountability in terms of anti-corruption, and also to return the assets of Sudanese to the Sudanese from the coffers of the National Congress Party and its members. So there were strategic reasons for the disagreement, but I would argue equally there were kind of economic interests. Sudanese now, to kind of summarize this for you, have come to calling the coalition that is against the peace and who supporting the Abdel Fattah Burhan's military, the coalition of money and power. Just to give you an idea of why this is so important. In April 15th, 2023, everything came to an explosive point, and that is these disagreements basically led to a catalyst in which provocations, and there's a great deal of contention around this, but it's clear that the tensions on both parties were increasing. There was a prisoner's dilemma, so to speak. Each party was concerned that the other party was actually going to begin a war. We know, of course, that that during the day of the war, you had Hemeti traveling or sending troops to the northern airport of Medawi to try to make sure that those Air Force or airplanes on the part of the Sudanese Air Force would not kind of attack him. But we also know that there was provocation in Khartoum itself by forces allied to the Islamist regime and the former members of the National Congress Party that actually provoked also this war, leading very quickly to the expansion of the war, first in Khartoum, devastating Khartoum, of course, leading to now over 60% of the population of over 10 million have fled, but also leading, of course, quickly to the expansion of the war in the kind of home territory of, so to speak, in quotations, of Hemeti and his troops of the Rapid Support Forces in Darfur, then leading tragically in Darfur to hundreds of thousands of people displaced and other scores, of course, killed and massacred, and then unprecedentedly the expansion of the war to the western province of Kordofan. And in December of last year, the overrunning on the part of the Rapid Support Forces of the breadbasket of Sudan, Jazeera. Here is where you have the restarting of the Jeddah talks that first began in May of 2023 because of the changes of the kind of movements on the ground. I can detail the Jeddah declaration, but I want to, and all of that. I think, as usual, I speak more than the time that is allotted to me. Yeah, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Appreciate it. A lot of issues you've raised, very important issues that I hope will come up during the Q&A session. Jihan, the microphone is yours. Please activate your microphone. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. So I was asked to speak about the human rights and humanitarian situation, prospects for accountability. Given the very thorough and comprehensive landscape that Khalid just gave us, it might be worth pointing out that accountability and justice have been one of the main demands for the revolution since well before this war started. And of course, the war has generated far more demands for that. But it has been an abiding issue in Sudan for decades because of the number of wars and genocidal violence that the country has seen. Certainly since the former regime came to power, but even in episodes before it. So let me just start by also sort of painting a picture of what the main human rights issues are today, since the war obviously have completely upended the human rights community in Sudan. So civil society organizations that had been working on Sudan have been forced to leave along with everyone else. And so this has certainly impacted the human rights community's ability to properly document and investigate. But nevertheless, there are many people who are doing this with a lot of resilience remotely and from inside the country against all odds, an incredibly dangerous situation for them. Now, as we've already heard from our moderator, Sudan has been called the world's worst or the single largest humanitarian crisis on the planet. There are upwards of 10 million people displaced. Millions of people are also refugees now in neighboring countries, and famine has been declared in parts of Darfur by a very conservative body. And there are certainly indications that famine and acute hunger is far more widespread. And on top of that, there's a huge problem of obstruction of aid coming into the country by both of the warring sides. They have both obstructed and they have both attacked aid workers and medical workers. There's far too little aid from the international community, and then what little there is not being delivered due to violence by the belligerents. But this is also a huge human rights catastrophe. Of course, what I've just alluded to are human rights issues. It is a war crime and certainly a violation of international law for the aid to be obstructed and for these conditions to exist. But on top of that, we also have direct human rights violations happening in clear patterns. Certainly the killings, which are caused not only by both sides using explosives in urban areas, but we've also documented many cases of targeted killings by shooting. And then there are people who are caught up in gunshot battles. But in some of the epicenters of the conflict, particularly in West Darfur since the beginning of the conflict, we saw incredible violence against civilians as part of the ongoing conflict in West Darfur, which predated this war. The war exacerbated that, and essentially the RSF and its allies carried out massacres and what Human Rights Watch has documented and termed ethnic cleansing on the ethnic Masalit in West Darfur. And that was happening last year. And well over 10,000 people are said to have been killed in 2023 in El Geneina alone, and that's according to UN estimates. So that's actually a good segue to make the observation that whenever the media and research groups try to estimate the death toll in Sudan, it's almost meaningless because we've been saying the same thing now for many, many months. which is somehow upwards of 15,000. And yet in El Geneina alone, it was somehow it was between 10 and 15,000. So I think the numbers should be viewed with great suspicion. And the point is the conditions are so dangerous that the information is very difficult to establish. I think it's also quite back to sort of the patterns of violations. I think it's been well documented that there have been very large scale looting and pillage, largely by the RSF wherever it goes. So as the RSF took over parts of Darfur, and then as it moved toward Al Jazeera in December, for example, and certainly in Khartoum at the beginning, everyone living under RSF control was reporting a lot of looting and pillage, and along with that, a lot of other violations. Sexual violence has been a big trend in the Sudanese war. And several organizations are documenting cases. Again, it's very difficult to explain the prevalence of the cases. We cannot know exactly how many, but there are certainly hundreds that are already documented in various reports. My former colleagues at Human Rights Watch also recently released a report on patterns of sexual violence that included rape and gang rape and forced marriages, again, largely by the RSF in areas that it controlled. But we shouldn't assume that it's only the RSF committing violations. SAF too has carried out very predictable patterns of repression in areas under its control. And we see this particularly in the area of detentions, targeting activists for arbitrary detention. There have been a series of laws, emergency laws that have been adopted by various state governors to justify and legalize these practices of arbitrary detention, which are certainly tried and true in Sudan. The former National Security Agency has been resurrected and is detaining people without charge for long periods without any judicial review. So essentially, rule of law isn't there, even in the SAF-controlled areas, when it comes to protecting basic human rights. I should also point out that many of the victims of human rights violations occurring in both RSF and SAF areas are, in fact, the first responders. So aid workers, people who are volunteers and to whom the task of providing life-saving aid has fallen because the international or more formalized organizations that ordinarily come to provide humanitarian aid in contexts like this are not able to get in. There is no access. Again, back to the access issue, which is completely devastating so much of the country. So the aid workers themselves, the frontline responders, are particularly vulnerable, and their job is made so much more difficult by these entrenched patterns of repression. So much of that is ethnically targeted or identity targeted. So the power and control assumes that the volunteer must be against the army because he or she was rumored to formerly be part of a resistance committee and therefore is not wanted and detained. Even in the RSF areas, same issue, according to people who we've interviewed, who I've interviewed on the ground, in terms of their profile. Important for them to have good relations at the most local level with the relevant RSF commanders or the relevant authorities who are now working alongside the RSF because there isn't any other option. So any organization, civil society group, just individual volunteers, they must be on good terms with those actors in order to do their job. And sometimes that requires explaining away things that their relatives did or other aspects of their perceived identity. So it's very precarious for people inside Sudan trying to provide services, much in the humanitarian realm, but also in anything to do with human rights, anything to do with documenting what's going on. So that brings me to the point of accountability. I mentioned already that accountability was a key demand of the revolution before this war, and it remains so. As always, justice is very political, and it has been politicized. You now have the Sudanese government authorities have announced their willingness, for example, to cooperate with the ICC many months ago, but only insofar as it had to do with RSF crimes. Again, there's a committee. There are probably several investigation committees by now that prosecutors have announced to collect documentation and information of serious crimes committed by the RSF. So that those kinds of announcements by the authorities, saying that they're interested and committed to justice, should also be understood to be a political statement. We have not actually seen any justice yet for any violations by SAF soldiers. At least not. We haven't heard of anything yet, despite many promises. So that tells you a little bit about how the justice system is working post-war. The same goes on the RSF side. There have been official commitments to address sexual violence. There have been denials of occupation of hospitals and clinics, which is difficult to believe, considering how much evidence there is that RSF has done exactly that. So again, sort of either denials or statements that, oh, we will investigate, we will hold people accountable. So far, nothing. So there is no accountability. And there are many reasons to believe that it's not possible to get it inside Sudan right now in the war. What about after the war? So this brings me to the issue of transitional justice, which is something a lot of people were focused on before this war started. It was a very hot button topic because it linked back to the demands of the revolution, and it had to do with the idea that the government would change, there would be a transition, transitional justice would be part of a transition to democracy. Now that those plans, those steps that were taken during the transitional period are moribund. There has been no progress. What little progress there was quickly washed away with the military coup in October 2021. So now we should look forward and think about justice. We have on the international scene, I've already mentioned the ICC. It has announced that it is looking into cases in Darfur since the war started, and it should be urged to act on that as soon as possible in the hope that an announcement could have a deterrent effect. In my view, but the ICC is limited to Darfur. It cannot deal with cases elsewhere in Sudan unless there is a UN Security Council referral to deal with the rest of Sudan or other action. But at the moment, it's only Darfur. The UN also has a fact-finding mechanism that it established several months ago, and it has a good mandate to preserve evidence with a view to accountability. But its mandate is going to be up in September, and we are very much pushing for it to be renewed. We hope that it will present a powerful and good and useful report, but it has a good preparatory role to future justice, if you will. Aside from that, the African Union has authorized a fact-finding mission of its own. That has yet to happen, but that is also a good step. But essentially, unless the parties stop this war, justice really needs to be part of the solution, and it should be part of what happens next. People will be looking for it, calling for it, and there is a contentious view that, oh, in order to stop the war, you've got to shelve justice because you can't have accountability in order to have peace. Now, I would say, on the other hand, we have to scrutinize that very carefully because there's an awful lot of detail inside both of those words, justice and peace. And I think that's one of the challenges in a place like Sudan, is to see how exactly you can maintain the justice. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That's a big challenge that you just pointed to. We hope we can pick a little on that issue a little bit more during the Q&A. Thanks. And now we move to Hassan Haj Ali. Please activate your mic and proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khalil. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, I've been asked to speak about the military, the militia, and the armed groups. So I'm going to start with the military, the Sudanese armed forces. I will give a brief description, and also I will show the corporate interest of each of these groups. So the current leadership of SAF consists of those senior military officers in the previous regime of Omar al-Bashir. They were members of the Transitional Military Council announced by the Security Committee that hosted President al-Bashir. The President of the Transitional Sovereign Council, General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, was the Inspector General of the Armed Forces, and General Shamsuddin al-Kabashi served as Commander of Joint Forces, and General Ibrahim Jabir, the Commander of the Navy, and Lieutenant General Yasser al-Ata was the Commander of the Border Guards. This group is the one appointed to the Sovereign Council representing the military. The armed forces have expanded into the economic field, owing companies operating in the field of military manufacturing and the economy. Several companies are part of the defense industry system. This is one of the largest corporations in the country. It has a wide network of economic businesses in the field of gold mining and various fields of trade. To harness them to enhance its power. This situation enabled SAF to be one of the largest political forces in the country, especially during the transitional period. So now I will mention briefly the corporate interests of the army. Leader of SAF seeks to secure the interests of the military and the non-interference in its regulatory affairs in the transitional period. This policy was reflected in the constitutional document, which gave the military component the right to appoint the Minister of Defense and to consult with the civilian component of the government in appointing the Director of the Intelligence Service. Also, SAF project an image of the Guardian of the Homeland, Lieutenant General Yasser al-Ata, once noted, quote, "The armed forces will respond firmly and responsibly to those who seek to undermine the security, unity, and stability of the country." Also, SAF oppose to any rival to its entity. Now I will talk about the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. So these forces went through 4 main stages in their development. This is for the sake of those who are not following Sudan closely. The first stage was the Janjaweed militia stage, which was linked to the emergence of the armed groups in Darfur in 2002, 2003. And the government used them to suppress these movements. During that period, the militia reflected organizational fluidity and was unofficially linked to the government and was accused of committing major human rights violations. The second stage began in the second half of 2013 when Musa Hilal's group was attached to the border guards, to the Border Intelligence Brigade. This later on, the name was changed to the Border Guard Forces. Although these forces were established were established under the auspices of SAF, they were not officially integrated to it. The main aim is to give them freedom of movement and to collect information. In 2013, the militia was given the name of Rapid Support Forces. The aim was to impose order and discipline on those forces, so they were subordinate at that time to the National Security and Intelligence Service. However, due to the tension between the government at that time and Musa Hilal, the Sudanese government appointed Muhammad Hamdan Daglo, Himeti, as the commander of the Rapid Support Forces and granted him the rank of Brigadier General after he had been a soldier fighting under Musa Hilal. The third stage occurred in 2017 with the legalization of the status of these forces, when the National Assembly, the legislative body at that time, passed a law called the Support Forces Act and made them subordinate to the SAF. But despite the annexation, the forces retained their separate leadership, their own uniforms, their own facilities, and their own license plates. They also played a regional role, participating in the war in Yemen, and played a limited role in Libya alongside General Haftar. The final stage, this occurred at the time of the revolution of December 2018, when the forces was summoned to Khartoum by al-Bashir before just few days of his toppling. But upon arrival to Khartoum, Himeti realized that the regime's days were numbered. He sided with the Security Committee's decision to remove al-Bashir, and he was confirmed as the deputy head of the military committee. An important development occurred at that time, which strengthened the autonomy of the RSF, which is the amendment to the RSF law. That amendment repealed Article 5 of the law, which previously placed the forces under the command of the armed forces. Now, Himeti was assured of independence. Now I'll move to the strategic interest of the RSF. These strategic forces changed with the changes that happened in the country. Before the revolution, its main aim at that time was to combat the armed movements in Darfur, support the regime, and secure al-Bashir. After the uprising and assuming a new position, General Himeti's strategic goals changed, and his growing aspiration to play a role in the political future of the country became apparent, supported by his military arm, regional role, and extensive economic network. Now, SAF is being transformed from a militia and a paramilitary force into an army, actually, a rival army. They have their own medical services, their own communication network, their own wiretapping unit, a civil defense service, land administration unit, a media department, a daily newspaper, and even a canine unit. It was planning to establish a university. So now the role, the regional role they play,
Apparently, the line is disrupted here, so it looks longer than the previous glitch. So let's go ahead and move to the next speaker at this time, Khulud Khair. The next 12 minutes are yours. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Khalil. And thank you to previous speakers. Very interesting, as always, to hear from Khalid and Jihan. The question is, what are the challenges towards seeking a resolution to this war? And the challenges are so many, I think it would take us all day to count them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one thing that we have to do is situate this in sort of the historical trend of these wars in Sudan. Sudan has had, I see that Ustaz Hassan is back. Should we give him a chance to finish and then I can take over?
Dr. Hassan, would you like a minute to conclude?
Yeah, like 2 minutes. 2 minutes, I will finish because I have the last group of the armed groups.
Real quick, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. So we have the armed groups, they form the Revolutionary Front, those who are fighting actually the government. And then they signed the peace agreement in Juba, not all of them, but the majority, with the exception of the Sudan Liberation Movement North and the People's Liberation Movement North and Sudan Liberation Movement, the Wahid Nur. But what are the strategic interests of these armed groups? Although these groups, they have national issues, like the form of the state, citizenship, and distribution of power and wealth, they also have regional and local issues. We see this in the political declaration issued in 2013. Quote, they said they want to build federal institutions to ensure representation of the different regions, respect for cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity. Also, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, they have a constitution issued in 2017. Article 8 refers to the following. They want to decentralize the government, that the land is the customary property of indigenous peoples and the right to self-determination for all peoples of the regions of Sudan. Finally, the political entities of SAF, the RSF, or the armed groups, they are highly adaptable, as evidenced by significant changes in their alliances, political rhetoric, and overall political stance. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Appreciate it. Khulud, please resume. Go ahead.
No problem. Thank you. Hope everyone can hear me. The challenges to reaching a solution are many. For one thing, neither side looks like it wants a deal right now. Neither side looks like it wants a ceasefire. And this looks like different things within different parties. For SAF, it's a case of, they have always done, they want to use the mediations to exact some kind of support from the different entities, whether it's the Saudis or the Americans, whomever the mediators are, to better position themselves to win the war militarily. For the RSF, they want to position themselves ahead of talks into a better position to be able to bargain for more during the talks. And what that means is that both of them will be effectively seeking a push towards some kind of victory, both political and military, before they think of a ceasefire. Now, that's not necessarily counterproductive, because we do know that it doesn't make sense to expect belligerent parties to put down their weapons unless they know what the political dispensation that is coming looks like. So I think there's an issue with the sequencing as well of current mediations. I know that the emergency mediations that were set up by the US and Saudis in April, when the war started last year, was very much intended to bring about a quick resolution to this war. But I think now that hopefully there is a better understanding that this war won't end very quickly, at least in a very haphazard way, that there does need to be much more emphasis on the political agreement that would follow rather than just simply a ceasefire, and that the political agreement will decide how a ceasefire comes about. But there are other issues related to the fact that, historically, Sudan's history tells us that this war could last 20 years. If you have the first Sudanese civil war that lasted 18 years, the second lasted 22 years, and the Darfur conflict is 20 years and counting. So Sudan doesn't do short wars. And if that's the case, and I really hope it isn't, then we do need to think about how we make investments in the current moment that will set us up in good stead for when a ceasefire comes, to make sure it holds. And when a ceasefire comes and a political agreement comes, they're actually able to be implemented and they're actually sustainable. We know that there are a lot of groups. There's a constellation of different groups on both the RSF and the SAF side. They have militias working with them. They have a constellation of different constituencies on their side. And even if but the leadership of the SAF and the RSF were to sign a ceasefire or a political deal, there's no guarantee that that would actually filter down to the militias that they have on the ground, that they too would cease fire. What we saw with the Juba Peace Agreement of 2020 was that when groups at the top, at the leadership level in Khartoum, would sign an agreement, the militias that are allied with them often do not get the memo, and often new political contestations and competitions arise when some of the older ones have been addressed. And because of the nature of peacemaking in Sudan, it's very much wealth sharing and power sharing. There's not enough power, really. There are not enough positions to ensure that everyone is catered to in that kind of modality. There isn't enough, the pie is not big enough. It certainly wasn't big enough before the war. Now it is even smaller, considering the state collapse that we're witnessing. There's just not enough to hand out to all of the different armed groups that are currently engaged in this war. So we do need to have a very good think about changing the modality of peacemaking in Sudan. Wealth sharing and power sharing no longer serve, they never did, but they certainly don't serve the current political and military dynamics in the country. Now, there have been, to my mind, far too many mediation processes that are taking place, none of which have worked very well together, none of which have worked very well apart. I mean, we all know the issues with the Jeddah process. The format was very much based on not using leverage to ensure that both sides commit to a ceasefire. So even though agreements were signed, like the May 11 agreement that is talked so much about, there was never any inducement to make sure that that agreement was signed, and there were never any consequences for breaking that agreement, as well as the others that were agreed to at the time. There's the issue of leverage, I think, is really important. When the war broke out, there were only a few times where we actually heard the fighting stop, when we heard the guns stop for a minute, the artillery stop for several hours, and there was relative quiet in Khartoum. And that was when the Egyptian soldiers were extracted out. It was when the US embassy evacuated, and it was when the UN and INGOs evacuated. And we know that there was an inordinate amount of pressure on the two sides to abide by a ceasefire at that time. And that's the kind of pressure and leverage that we haven't seen since. So we know it can be mustered. It just hasn't been mustered since then. So there does need to be sort of a level of thinking around some of these mediating countries, chiefly the United States, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, about what it would take to actually bring about the leverage, put it on the table, and ensure that at least these two parties, if not the others that are allied with them, would be in a position to adhere to a ceasefire. When we look at the way that for example, Jeddah process interacts with the UN mediations, the AU mediations, particularly the initial IGAD mediations, we see that there isn't a sort of thread that runs alongside them. Each one is doing very, very different things. If we take the regional picture, AU and IGAD, when the war broke out, the IGAD heads of state, particularly led by Kenyan President Ruto, said, we want to have a heads of state delegation send it to Khartoum, alongside other presidents from Djibouti, South Sudan, etc., to go to, and Ethiopia, to go to Sudan and speak to the generals. That obviously hasn't worked. There were other presidential level engagements as well through IGAD that also haven't worked. When we look at how the AU is engaging with Sudan, it's very much at the commissioner level. And that is problematic for two reasons. One, it's at a very different level to the IGAD interventions. And so there's no way to make these two things work well together or be congruous. And two, we know that there are issues at the commission level, speaking frankly, that the head of the AU Commission, Moussa Faki, frankly, is too invested in what goes on in Sudan to be that neutral arbiter. And anybody who's, been in Sudan in the past sort of 6-7 years or so since at the time of the revolution will remember that the AU has had a very particular type of engagement, particularly with undermining civil society and undermining some of the revolutionary demands throughout first the negotiation period ahead of the transitional government, and then, of course, after the coup as well. So I don't think the AU is the right platform, as it currently is, to sort of spearhead the kind of changes that that many people in Sudan want. There are elections at the AU this year. By February, there'll be a change at the commission level. Maybe by February, we will see a change. But before that, I highly doubt. There are somewhat, I think there's a recognition that there is an issue here in terms of how the mediators mediate themselves, how they put aside some of their ego, some of their personal interests. And because of that, we saw first in April of this year and then later on in July, just last month, 2 sort of mediator retreats where they got together and tried to figure out how to sequence, how to coordinate on the mediation issue. But none of those have really borne any fruit. There frankly exist too many opposing and competing interests amongst the mediators and some of the entities that they represent to currently put together a holistic and comprehensive mediation that would actually bring about the requisite leverage that I spoke about, the right constituencies that I spoke that have been very integral to this, including and especially young people, young youth sort of networks and organizations, resistance committees, etc., women's groups, and others that we haven't really seen feature, rather than aside from as an afterthought in the current mediations. I don't want to take too long because I know I want to leave time for questions, but just all that is to say that there currently doesn't exist any avenue of mediation that brings about the right set of prerequisites or preconditions that can lay the foundations for either a ceasefire or a political process, and there doesn't exist the sequencing to ensure that a ceasefire would actually take hold. And specifically on the sequencing issue, just before I leave off, a ceasefire will not save lives. It's very important to realize that when we're trying to save lives, it is protection mechanisms that will do so. And it's also protection mechanisms at the community level, at the sub-regional level, and at the national level, that when a ceasefire does come, we'll be able to enable that ceasefire to take hold a lot better, because protection mechanisms prioritize human rights monitoring and adherence, they prioritize rule of law, they prioritize community-based resilience, and they prioritize physical protection, particularly of women and girls, but also other populations. And those are the kinds of things that could build the preconditions to make a ceasefire hold when it does come. Thank you.
Thank you, Khulud. Let me start with the first question to you, actually. You have highlighted quite a few challenges, and rightly so. They're all important. I think your analysis is head on. But if we are to, practically speaking, pick and choose, which we usually can't in these types of processes, but if we are to pick and choose and target the most immediate challenge, I know you hinted at that in the last remarks you just made, but which one would you choose? Which challenge you feel should be targeted first and resolved before Sudanese can move forward and make progress?
Put very simply, the fact that the search for a ceasefire right now is not an appropriate use of time and efforts, or rather the singular focus on the search for a ceasefire is not, I think, the right use of time and efforts. Much better use of time would be around to figure out how it is to save lives, both in terms of responding to the famine, as well as providing some of the physical security to different groups, which currently doesn't exist. People will say, for example, that this comes down to a sovereignty issue, that the Sudanese Armed Forces would be, the party to provide that kind of security. We simply haven't seen that play out. The Sudanese armed forces, as well as some of the constituencies behind them, the deep state, the Islamists, however you want to define them, who, by the way, do not feature in any mediation platform. They're not being engaged sufficiently at all, and they are the ones in many ways that are that hold the keys for some of the resolution to this war. The Sudanese armed forces cannot right now enact the right kind of protection mechanisms that we need to see. And looking at their history, they never have. So I think that there's a false sense of hope that the Sudanese armed forces could maybe finally act like the national entity that people expected to, but nothing in Sudan's history and in the current reality indicates that that's possible. So we need to look beyond the belligerents. Neither belligerent party is the answer to the same violence that is being wrought by these belligerent parties. Protection above all else, followed by what it would take to bring about a inclusive political agreement, and then thinking about how that would lead to a ceasefire.
Thank you very much. Our friend Mohammed Shinawi from the Voice of America just brought to my attention the latest update on Geneva. And basically the news item says, or the update says, US-led peace talks aimed at ending Sudan's 16-month war started in Geneva on Wednesday, but neither warring side attended. The army said days ago it would boycott the talks, while Rapid Support Forces delegation went to Switzerland, but at the last minute said they would not. They would stay away. Fighting between the SAF and RSF has killed thousands, driven, as we have mentioned, driven 10 million people from their homes, and sparked what the United Nations called the world's worst hunger crisis. Are you guys surprised? Let's address this. Let's see, Jihan, are you surprised by this report?
No, I mean, I think that most people who watch Sudan closely, despite all hopes, desperate hopes for something to materialize, I think that most people were not very optimistic that this would lead to constructive talks right away. But I'm noticing, and I'll see what others think. I'm interested in others' views too about whether there are signs, sort of reading between the lines as to maybe what could be happening if there is maybe a strategy on either side. I'm not sure.
Hassan, what's your reaction to the fact that no one participated?
Yeah, also, I'm not surprised because the government in Port Sudan, they declared that they're not going to go to Geneva unless the Jeddah Forum recommendation was implemented. And I think when the RSF delegation went to Geneva and they realized that without the counterpart, without SAF, any entering to talk would be futile or meaningless. So they decided to withdraw. So I'm not surprised also.
Khalid?
I'm not surprised at all. I think that everyone had expected that it would not fall apart. But I want to emphasize the progression of the talks. This is not to be optimistic in any way, but just to kind of put things in a little bit of context. One of the things I think, if you trace Jeddah, the IGAD and AU discussions, and of course, very importantly, the one in Bahrain, in Manama, I think that it's very important to understand or to at least, kind of question the issue of progression and change that Khulud mentioned. One of the big problems has been not only the domestic kind of dynamics and politics, but also the lack of coordination, with respect to regional and international actors. We had been saying from the beginning that there could be no movement, of course, if there isn't some kind of cohesive coordination. And I think that Manama in particular, as you trace these kind of progressions, you see an attempt, a momentum momentum. Interestingly enough, to talk about the external actors here, that there is a momentum and kind of changing or shift and a recognition of the urgency of the problem in Sudan and its spillover effect. I am not going to give a timeline in terms of ending the war or realizing a ceasefire, of course, but what I do want to emphasize are two things. One of them is that there is movement on external actors, at least let's say with respect to what the U.S. envoy has said, with respect to the need for a cohesive, coordinated, kind of alliance of external actors that together can put the kind of leverage that Khulud is talking about. I think that's important. For example, there's been a discussion of whether civil society should be in these talks or not. The U.S. envoy, for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, the politicization of these talks, they had felt that it was very important to just narrow the mandate for these talks between these two generals and have a very separate civil society track that comes later. We know from other contexts and other conflicts, I've been reading a lot on Liberia, the Liberian war, that actually that's not really the way it works. Unfortunately, you do have to include civil society actors for a couple of reasons. One of them is to make sure not to give legitimacy to either party, but number two, very importantly, is to kind of, help set the agenda right away, as Khulud mentioned. So there has to be not only coordination between the external actors, and here I'm specifically, frankly, talking about Egypt, the UAE, those who had previously had kind of been working at cross purposes. And domestically, you have to have the inclusion. The idea behind these talks was not that they were going to work out. The idea was to build the momentum and to very much kind of really focus, frankly, on the external actors, and bring them to the table. And that actually, in that sense, that was realized. You had the participation of the African Union, of the UAE, of Egypt, and people can disagree with that, but that is really what is behind this. So we want to focus on the momentum and the progression. In the case of, unfortunately, Liberia, it took from 1996 to 2003 for several kind of peace talks to come together. And I do want to mention that we have something very important. The majority of Sudanese do want to have a ceasefire and peace, obviously. The majority of Sudanese do want to have a professionalized army. The majority of Sudanese do want the exclusion of the rapid support forces because of their violation. This is not going to happen all the time, but I think it is important to foreground what the people of Sudan want. And so putting all of that together, I think that it's very important to emphasize that this should not be the last iteration of these peace talks or agreements. And I think that the diplomatic interventions, believe it or not, we have seen in all of the context of the African wars in the continent have actually ultimately come to some kind of outcome. Some have failed, absolutely, and some have succeeded, as in the case of Liberia. So we want to make sure to understand what are the mechanisms of that succeeding. I believe that there are a number of different elements of leverage for two reasons. One of them is the army has lost ground strategically on the ground, and another is that Hemeti has realized that there is neither legitimacy for him inside and certainly not outside, and that has to be maintained. And that was really the principal motivation, an opportunity for these talks. We have to call for more vigorous and constant and sustained interventions diplomatically, because we know the elections are coming. We know that this is partly because of that. And that is kind of my position. But I really do believe it's the majority of the position of the majority of people in Sudan.
Very interesting. In light of the report that I just read, that Muhammad sent us, Muhammad's real question is, I'm going to send it to Khulud. What is next? How would this conflict end in light of the fact that the two main parties are not participating? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What we're hearing is that the RSF has arrived to Switzerland, and
Right.
that they do intend to take part in the sort of mediations. But of course, you can't mediate with just one party. But that doesn't mean that you can't hold security talks with some of these parties. Actually, speak to them about fulfilling some of the agreements and commitments that they have already made, including the May 11th agreement. To, as Khalid said, use the opportunity to say that, you know, if you want international legitimacy, it doesn't mean you're going to get it. But there are some things that you do need to do in terms of abiding by international humanitarian law and other, you know, aspects of international norms that they have been, frankly, you know, sort of contravening at every step. You know, there is room to talk to them about, for example, the humanitarian aid and how they have been standing in the way of humanitarian aid, how they have been violently pushing back on some delivery of humanitarian aid, how, you know, there is room to discuss some of these, to hold some of these security talks with the RSF, and at the same time ensure that there continues to be an open line to the SAF. This morning, we heard that Blinken had called Burhan and asked him to reconsider coming within the first 72 hours of this, so basically until tomorrow, after which time, you know, SAF's refusal to come would sort of, you know, have a line drawn under it, and a different strategy for engaging SAF would be pursued. But the point is, exactly as Khalid said, this is should not be considered a one and done. And there was a sort of a concern that this would be considered simply just a pre-election intervention by the United States rather than the beginnings of a longer-term strategy of engagement with the two sides. But above all, the biggest use of this, you know, what Geneva could really be used for is that for the first time, we have seen a whole of US government approach to this. If you look at some of the pictures, you see people from across, you know, sort of the military, civilian, National Security Council, you know, the sort of the UN, the US UN team, etc. It's a whole of US government approach. We haven't had that before. What that means is that there's also room for learning within the US government about how potentially it could lead this process better if it continues to plan, frankly, to do so. Above all, as I said, mediating between the mediators is such a critical thing. And because we have, you know, the head of the AU panel there, Mohammed ibn Chambas, we have Lamamra, the UN personal envoy, we have the United Arab Emirates, we have the Egyptians, we have the Saudis, we have a whole host of people in that room that frankly need to be at least somewhat closer to getting on the same page, because therein, the competitions between them are actually feeding a lot of what's happening on the ground in this conflict.
Thank you. Aida Abdul Rahim, thank you for organizing this webinar and for your remarks and answers. She is wondering about the role of Israel. Has Israel, since normalizing relations with Sudan, attempted to play a role in these internal differences in trying to, let's say, participate in the process or bring parties together or mediate on its own? Is there a role for the Israelis in this process or not yet? Whoever would like to take this one. It's an open question not addressed to a specific person. Hassan, would you like to tackle this one?
Maybe I will start. Both Al-Burhan and Hemeti, they have good relationship with the Israelis, but they are competing actually. I think Al-Burhan is working with the National Security Council, while Hemeti is working with the Mossad. But both of them are competing because they regard the Israeli support significant, and especially for Hemeti, he needs to project an image, especially in a positive image in Western countries, especially in the United States. And he thinks one way to do that is through having good relations with Israel, the Israeli government. And I think also Al-Burhan is doing the same, trying to gain some legitimacy. And maybe in the early days, it is a way to remove Sudan from the list of states who are sponsoring terrorism. But I don't see any direct involvement currently, because Israel itself is so much occupied with the war in Gaza. But at the end, both of them, they have good connections within Israel.
Khalid, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I think that It's important to answer that question in the context of the normalization strategy generally, Khalil, and the kind of motivation of why the questions about this actually emerge and have arisen since kind of the Israeli or attempt on the Israeli UAE and even the Trump administration at that time to kind of forge that normalization in Sudan. It was done, of course, under a non-democratic regime or period in Sudan. But I think most importantly, it's important to kind of speak or tackle head on the relationship of the UAE as really the primary liaison with respect to that, and the UAE's relationship to its interest in Sudan and elsewhere. And it's no secret to know that prior to this particular iteration of the horrible war in Gaza, that was kind of in the planning, so to speak. Since then, of course, that has fallen apart. That, I think, is the way to try to link or to understand any relationship of Israel and the war to Sudan. So I agree with Hassan in that sense, but I think we have to see the larger picture. In other words, all roads in this instance lead to Abu Dhabi. And the reason I mentioned that is that I think it's important for us to be clear about discussing the UAE's role. That is something that is public knowledge. It's a campaign Sudanese care deeply about. It has been instrumentalized by the regime of Burhan and his deputy Yasser al-Attah for their own purposes. So we want to be clear-eyed about understanding the role of the UAE. I, for one, and this is controversial, but I'm happy to say it here, that I think the inclusion of the UAE as a primary spoiler for peace in Sudan in these talks is crucial. I think it is inexcusable and frankly unconscionable that the present regime of Burhan would say, we're not coming because the UAE is there. First of all, they're the ones who initially began their relationship with the UAE over 20 years ago. They're the ones who traded. They're the ones who participated in that close relationship. They're the ones who gave them access to the gold, and they're the ones who gave them land. So it's ridiculous for them now to say for their own self-interest and because of the lack of inclusion of the National Congress Party members that they will not speak to the UAE. The only way to come to an agreement with respect to the issue of gold and its relationship to the war, for example, is to put pressure on the UAE, and that is, at least on paper, what the United States said that they are hoping to do. If you disagree with the UAE, absolutely go to the talks or future talks and tell them that you do disagree. This is something the Sudanese people are saying in their unanimity, and this is also a matter of practical. It's a practical matter. So I want to kind of shift that conversation, which is an important one, a question about Israel, to what is directly kind of important to our concern here, and that is the role of external actors as either playing a negative or positive role in the future of Sudan.
If I can just add to that, please, Khalil.
Yeah, please,
just when it comes to the question of Israel, both sides, as Hassan said, they are trying to court the Israelis, and they have been for some time. Of course, SAF started as early as 2016 under the Bashir regime when they made a break with the Iranians. Now that they are back again with the Iranians, and the Iranians are increasingly asking for more political favors from Port Sudan, it's going to be difficult for Burhan and the senior leadership of the SAF to balance what they're getting from the Iranians from what they can get from the Israelis. And I don't think the Israelis are in a very amenable mood at the moment to engage with anybody, to engage favorably with anybody who's engaging favorably with the Iranians. So I guess it all depends on the extent to which Burhan can be the political operator that Bashir was in terms of playing out these different geostrategic competitions.
Excellent. Khalid, you spoke in detail about the UAE role in these issues. We have a question from Buhlal bin Ali Al-Ghul talking about essentially that role. Are you in agreement with Buhlal in terms of that these external elements to Sudan seem to have essentially added fuel to the fire in terms of finding a solution and peaceful solution to this conflict, whether it's based on UAE interest or Libyan interest or what have you. And particularly the media coverage of this issue has made it even much more complicated for lack of depth in understanding or explaining this issue. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do agree with that assessment, with a caveat or a kind of a particular emphasis, and that is, and here I'm speaking both, if you don't mind, as an academic, but mostly as also a Sudanese citizen, and that is first and foremost the kind of factors of this war have to do with domestic factors among Sudanese and the history of Sudan. I think that that's extremely important to emphasize. We have to take stock of all of the different kind of elements that domestically, this is a Sudan problem, and Sudanese have not been able to resolve it. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I say that because I know hopefully many Sudanese are watching, and I know that I speak for the majority of them. It's not about conspiracy theories. However, do external actors actually sustain these kind of conflicts in the post-colonial era? Absolutely, yes. They may not necessarily cause it, but absolutely they sustain it, they fuel it, they change the dynamic. But we know from looking at all of these different wars is that there is real agency, real choice on the part of local actors. In fact, the history of Sudan has shown that what has happened is that Bashir regime was absolutely expert at utilizing the different alliances in order to maintain power. So, the outside actors are not omnipotent, they're not all powerful, and they play and instrumentalize. This is why we have to really focus first and foremost on the domestic reasons for this conflict. Another thing about the campaign about the UAE is that I'm not from the UAE, I have never been there, but we have to really understand that, the real interests behind the UAE that go beyond Sudan. This is a country that is interested in diversifying its economy. This is a country that is concerned about the energy transition, that is campaign that is going on globally. This is a country that is also deeply, deeply concerned about food security issues, which are so important for them. Livestock and not just gold is one of the most kind of important exports to the Gulf and to the United Arab Emirates. We have to look at the UAE in its general, why is it so overly invested seemingly in Sudan? And that has to do with real domestic and security issues that they perceive. All of those have to be taken to the table and discussed very seriously to understand, the difference between fueling a war and having cordial and mutually beneficial, potentially, relations. And that, I think, is important. I say that because I think that this discourse of the UAE is as important as it is, has become sensationalized to such an extent that it's confounding the Sudanese themselves in terms of what position they should take.
Hassan, does the U.S. have a responsibility in attempting to control some of its allies who are externally trying to influence or have made the conflict worse in the Sudan? Do you think the U.S. has a responsibility?
I think they have a responsibility. I was talking to one Western diplomat about the role, actually, of Western countries regarding those regional powers, especially United Arab Emirates, in fueling the conflict in Sudan. And he told me that, he said, when we weigh our interest in Sudan vis-a-vis the interest in the United Arab Emirates, we have so much interest there. So we will not be willing to compromise the United Arab Emirates' interest with the Sudanese. So we are not going to pressure United Arab Emirates, because we seek their help in Gaza and in other places. But I think if you are speaking from a humanitarian position, the US should exert more pressure on the United Arab Emirates, especially in sending arms to the RSF. And this is now becoming obvious. The last article in the Foreign Affairs about United Arab Emirates' secret war in Sudan highlighted how deeply the United Arab Emirates is involved in the country. So there is at least a moral obligation on the United States to exert more pressure concerning the humanitarian situation in the country.
Thank you very much. I would like to apologize to the many people in the audience who have sent questions in the last couple of minutes because our time is up. Particularly, I apologize to Crystal Ofori. I wanted to follow up on that in terms of the role of the U.S. The question regarding Egypt and the UAE, why are they on opposite sides of this conflict? Nathan Sebring, great question. I would have loved to spend some time on that. And definitely Michael Scott, that was a very thorough, detailed question that probably would take another half an hour to deal with these complex issues, and to Tariq Abu Saleh. So thank you all for your questions. And I wish we had the time to do that. May I now basically thank our participants, our panelists, Khulud, Hassan, Khalid, and Jihan, for your very valuable contribution to this discussion. Appreciate your time. I know it's a busy period. I know several of you are traveling, and that's why we have joined together from different capitals, different countries today to do this panel. Arab Center is delighted to have focused on this issue because, frankly, I mean, the viciousness of the conflict in Gaza has kind of set our energies and our focus mostly on that lately. But this is a very, very important, as we have heard and as we have seen, a very, very important conflict. And I was fascinated. I mean, as a student of Arab-Israeli politics, I was fascinated by the similarities, by the way, Khulud, in terms of the sequencing, in terms of the need to focus on the political outcome, and so on. I mean, so some of the problems we are facing today in Geneva are the same problems we're facing in Doha. It is kind of interesting, and invite the mediators to take a look at that and see what we can learn from each other. Again, thank you so much for your time that you spent with us today, and thank you for our audience. We've had an international audience, a couple of hundred people from throughout the world that joined us today, and invite you to join us again in future events and webinars, particularly by Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I bid you peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.